The day the police cars rolled up to my pasture, I knew this wasn't going to end quietly. One phone call from an HOA woman who didn't like what she couldn't control had suddenly turned my land into a crime scene. Sirens, flashing lights, neighbors watching from behind their curtains, and behind me, a restless animal that didn't understand paperwork, rules, or threats. She thought authority would force me into compliance. She thought a badge would make her right. What she didn't account for was what happens when fear, ego, and a very angry bull collide at the worst possible moment. And once it started, there was no stopping it. Before any rules were enforced or accusations thrown around, life on my property was quiet in a way most people only imagine. The land sat just far enough outside the tight rows of identical houses to feel like a different world, but close enough to still be part of the same community. Mornings began with open skies, the sound of hooves shifting through grass, and the steady routines that come with maintaining a working pasture. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, predictable, and peaceful. I had moved there for exactly that reason. After years of noise, neighbors pressed wall to wall, and constant tension over parking spaces and property lines, I wanted space. Not isolation, but breathing room. A place where the land worked the way it always had, where animals were part of the rhythm instead of a nuisance. The pasture wasn't new. It had existed long before the neighborhood expanded toward it, long before the sidewalks and manicured lawns crept closer year by year. At first, the coexistence seemed simple enough. New homeowners waved politely. Cars slowed as they passed the fence. Some people even stopped to take photos, treating the pasture like a charming feature rather than an inconvenience. For a while, it felt like one of those rare situations where rural life and suburban growth could exist side by side without conflict. But small shifts started happening. The neighborhood began changing in tone, not in appearance, but in attitude. More signs appeared. More rules were posted on community boards. More meetings were held about things that had never been problems before. Lawns had to be a certain length. Fences had to look a certain way. Vehicles couldn't stay parked too long in one spot. Everything had a standard, and every standard came with consequences. The homeowners association had grown stronger as the neighborhood expanded. What started as a group meant to manage shared spaces slowly turned into something far more watchful. Enforcement became personal. Some people seemed to thrive on it, treating compliance like a form of control rather than cooperation. And the closer the development crept toward my pasture, the more often unfamiliar faces appeared at the fence line, observing, judging, taking notes. I didn't attend HOA meetings. I didn't need to. My property wasn't governed by their rules, at least not on paper. The pasture existed in a legal gray area that most residents didn't understand and some didn't want to. To them, it was an eyesore. A reminder that not everything fit neatly into their vision of order. The bull had always been there. Large, powerful, and territorial in the way animals are when their space matters. He wasn't aggressive without reason, but he was protective, especially when unfamiliar activity lingered too close for too long. I respected that. I worked around it. The fence was maintained, the boundaries were clear, and nothing had ever crossed the line into danger. Still, tension has a way of building quietly. A look held a little too long. A complaint passed along secondhand. A note left where it didn't belong. It became clear that someone nearby wasn't just uncomfortable with the pasture, they were determined to change it. And unlike most people who grumbled privately, this person believed authority could be borrowed, rules could be stretched, and pressure could force a result. By the time I realized the situation was more than passive disapproval, the gears were already turning. Phone calls were being made. Assumptions were being documented. What had once been a peaceful edge of the neighborhood was slowly being reframed as a problem that needed solving. And I had no idea just how far someone was willing to go to prove they were right, or how quickly a quiet morning could turn into something no one could control. The first notice came in the form of a letter slipped under my gate one morning, crisp and official looking, stamped with the HOA seal. At first, I thought it was routine, perhaps a reminder about dues or a community meeting. But as soon as I read the words, my stomach sank. They claimed the pasture violated aesthetic standards and community harmony rules. They demanded I cut the grass to a precise height, remove certain unsanctioned posts and fencing, and, in their words, correct the visual disruption immediately. The language was sterile, almost absurdly polite, but the implication was clear: my property, my livelihood, my animals were suddenly a problem. I stared at the paper for a long moment, wondering if someone was playing a joke. But when I glanced up, the neighbor who had lived across the street for less than a year was standing by their mailbox, smirking. Their new lawn glistened under the morning sun, perfectly trimmed, pristine, apparently, rules applied selectively. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control, about asserting dominance over a space I had every legal right to occupy. And they weren't going to stop until they got it. The first response I made was cautious. I drafted a polite email, outlining the legal boundaries of my property, the long history of the pasture, and the fact that no formal code enforcement notice had ever been issued. I attached photos of the land, the fence, and the animals, showing everything was well maintained. I hit send with a quiet confidence, thinking clarity and reason would be enough. I was wrong. The next week, things escalated. The HOA scheduled a compliance inspection. They didn't notify me in advance, simply showed up unannounced, walking across my property as if they owned it. They measured, noted, and whispered among themselves, their clipboards shaking in their hands with the seriousness of auditors investigating a criminal enterprise. I watched from the porch, jaw tight, as my bull shifted nervously in the corner of the pasture, nostrils flaring. The tension between authority and instinct was palpable. That inspection wasn't just uncomfortable, it was the start of harassment. Letters followed, piling up like a storm. Each one claimed some new violation. First, they said the fence posts were non-standard. Then, the grass height was too irregular. A week later, a notice claimed the pasture was negatively impacting neighborhood property values. Each letter carried a threat, fines, legal action, or escalation to local authorities. Every time I thought it had peaked, a new rule appeared, a new infraction discovered. One morning, I woke to find a flyer taped to my gate. It was a full-page notice about the community's beautifully maintained properties, and in the corner, in smaller print, my pasture was highlighted as an example of non-compliance. My neighbors drove by, some sneering, some shaking their heads. My property, which had always been a point of pride and tranquility, was now publicly shamed. The emotional weight hit harder than any legal notice could. I felt anger bubble alongside exhaustion, a mix of frustration and disbelief. How had it come to this? I tried escalation in a different way. I reached out to the HOA president, asking for a meeting to clarify what was expected and to negotiate a reasonable solution. I thought if I explained the animals' needs, the natural terrain, the long-standing legality of the property, we could find common ground. But the response was almost theatrical in its dismissal. I was accused of being uncooperative and defiant, told that community rules applied to all residents without exception. They claimed their authority extended further than I ever imagined, as if the law and logic were mere suggestions. Tensions mounted during the evenings. Neighbors I had once waved to now avoided eye contact. Some whispered as I passed, throwing speculative comments about what would happen next. I felt watched constantly. Every time I stepped outside, my bull shifted, nostrils flaring, sensing the underlying tension before I even did. Every phone call, every email, felt like it could escalate into a confrontation. And, indeed, it did. The tipping point came on a Tuesday afternoon when a complaint was lodged claiming that the bull had intimidated someone walking near the fence. I knew exactly who had filed it. The neighbors had figured out how to weaponize the rules and the fear they could manufacture. Suddenly, my pasture was under scrutiny from local law enforcement. Officers arrived, politely but firmly, explaining they had a complaint to investigate. I opened the gate for them, keeping calm, knowing that any misstep could be used against me. The officers walked slowly along the fence line, observing the bull, checking its condition, noting the space and the distance from the road. I explained its temperament, its routine, its harmlessness unless provoked. They nodded politely, made notes, and left. But the damage had already been done. The HOA now had law enforcement on its side, or at least the appearance of it. Every new notice carried an unspoken weight: they could escalate, and perhaps they would, Then came the fines. The letters arrived in sets, each dated consecutively, each with increasing amounts. $100, $250, $500. They claimed cumulative violations for each day that compliance had not been achieved. I pored over them, reading the fine print, noting the absurdity of charging someone for maintaining their own property exactly as it had been for decades. But fighting them felt like opening a battle I wasn't sure I could win. The HOA had numbers, rules, and intimidation tactics. I had only stubbornness and principle. The strain wasn't only on paper. My family felt the tension as I did. Every sound outside, the hum of an unfamiliar car, the shuffle of feet near the fence, made us flinch. Conversations around the dinner table frequently returned to strategy, how to respond, whether to document everything, whether legal counsel was worth engaging. My bull became hyper-aware, sensing our emotions, pacing more than usual, snorting when anyone approached the boundary. The stress was contagious. It was feeding the very conflict that now seemed impossible to resolve peacefully. As weeks went by, more subtle forms of harassment emerged. Anonymous complaints about noise, visitors, and traffic appeared in the mailbox. Someone had taken to photographing the pasture from across the street, sending images with exaggerated claims of violation. I started noticing strangers slowing down as they drove past, cameras discreetly pointed at the fence, their eyes watching for a moment's misstep. The psychological weight was crushing, an invisible army of rules, complaints, and judgment pressing down. And then the confrontation on the property itself happened. It was a Saturday, bright sun, nothing unusual in the sky, when a new neighbor, someone who had joined the HOA only months prior, decided to walk across the far end of the pasture while my bull grazed nearby. The animal didn't charge immediately, but its ears flicked, nostrils flared, muscles tensed. I called out from the porch, waving, signaling the boundary. The neighbor ignored it. A second later, the bull let out a warning snort, a sound that made the ground itself feel alive. The intruder jumped back, startled, running toward the edge of the property. I ran down the path to intervene, but by the time I reached the fence, it was clear the situation was spiraling. It felt as though every injustice, every petty complaint, every rule had been building to this moment. The bull, unprovoked in his own space but instinctively protective, embodied the tension I had been living with for weeks. My neighbors, my opponents in this suburban battlefield, had underestimated how boundaries, when crossed, provoke consequences. And I realized that this confrontation, this moment of physical, undeniable presence, was the inevitable next chapter. After the chaos, law enforcement arrived. The homeowner, male, 35, casual shirt, jeans, calm but cautious, calmly explained the events to the officers, pointing toward the bull, large, dark brown, standing alert but calm. The HOA president, 42, bob haircut, blouse and skirt, frustrated and humiliated, and board members, male, 50, balding, female, 38, blazer, shocked, stood nearby, their expressions a mix of disbelief and defeat. The damaged car sat in the background, crumpled from the unexpected charge. Neighbors lingered at a distance, some recording on their phones, others whispering in stunned awe. The officers nodded, making notes on the temperament of the bull, the legality of the property, and the sequence of events. The tension shifted, authority had been humbled, and the power dynamic that had oppressed the homeowner for weeks was visibly overturned. The realization spread slowly across the street. Attempts at intimidation had limits, and natural boundaries, when respected and defended, could not be ignored. The homeowner took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few weeks slowly ease. Each step toward the fence was deliberate, measured, as if reclaiming the land he had nurtured for years. The bull grazed nearby, calm but alert, a silent protector who had played his part without understanding the politics unfolding around him. Conversations with the officers were methodical and thorough, the law was clear, and the facts supported him. The HOA president's voice, once sharp and commanding, had lost its authority in that moment, replaced with frustration that echoed through the cul-de-sac. By the time law enforcement left, it was clear that the homeowner had not only defended his property but also reinforced the principle that reason and patience could withstand even the most relentless overreach. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the neighborhood's scrutiny began to fade. The homeowner, 35, casual shirt, jeans, satisfied and reflective expression, walked along the wooden fence, inspecting repairs, ensuring everything was secure yet natural. The bull, large, dark brown, calm, grazed peacefully nearby, no longer tense, no longer bracing for confrontation. Sunlight bathed the pasture in warm golden hues, highlighting the serene beauty of land that had survived the storm of petty rules and ego-driven enforcement. The HOA president and board members were noticeably absent from the pasture, their presence replaced by a quiet understanding among neighbors. Some avoided eye contact, others whispered admiringly, and a few paused to reflect on the ordeal they had witnessed. The community had learned a lesson in subtle ways: property rights, respect for boundaries, and the limits of authority had tangible consequences. For the homeowner, the resolution wasn't just about the land. It was about the principle that patience, preparation, and steadfastness can prevail against arbitrary control. Each moment spent walking the fence, observing the bull, and tending to the pasture was a reminder of what had been at stake. Life returned to its rhythms: mornings of open skies, the familiar sounds of hooves in the grass, and the quiet assurance that boundaries had been respected. The story left a lasting impression on everyone involved. The HOA had been humbled, neighbors had reconsidered their judgments, and the homeowner had proven that integrity and vigilance could safeguard not just property but dignity. As the sun dipped behind the distant houses, the pasture stood as a symbol of calm restored, a victory earned not through confrontation alone, but through persistence, reason, and respect for natural boundaries. The lessons were clear: authority unchecked invites resistance, rules without reason invite rebellion, and sometimes, the quietest guardians of justice wear hooves and stand in a field, reminding everyone that some things cannot be controlled.